So welcome to week 3 of the prayer course. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Charlotte. So let's just recap what we thought about so far. So far we've considered how to pray, and that the best way to grow in prayer is by asking Jesus to teach us how to pray. And I introduced the PRAY prayer model, which stands for pause, rejoice, ask, and yield or yes. We've talked about P and R and A so far, so the importance of pausing and taking time to be still before we start praying, and how rejoicing helps us fix our eyes on God and see the bigger picture. Then last week we focused in on A, or asking, and we looked at petition, so asking God for ourselves, and then intercession, which is asking God for the needs of others. So before we get started with prayer styles, let's look at one of the biggest obstacles that we face when we start praying, and that's unanswered prayer. So prayer is one of the most wonderful things in the world, but let's be honest, sometimes it's also the most painful. So Pete Greig has written an amazing book on unanswered prayer called God on Mute, which I'd highly recommend if you want to do some further reading. And the thing is, yes, prayer does work, and yes, there are miracles, but prayer doesn't always work the way that we want it or we need it to. And that can be incredibly painful. I've prayed for people and they've not gone better, or they've even gone on to die, and just the pain and the heartbreak of that is so real. And I think particularly in the middle of this virus, where so many of us are affected, this feels particularly poignant. The Bible is so honest about the struggles of unanswered prayer, though. Around half the Psalms aren't happy clappy, they're actually these bitter laments, and we are part of a faith that's all about wrestling. I wonder if you've ever thought about the fact that Jesus lived with unanswered prayer. When he visited his hometown, he couldn't do any miracles there, or how Jesus prayed that his church would be united, and last time I checked, that hasn't happened. Although I do want to add, it is amazing seeing the way that people have been coming together in response to this crisis. It's profoundly meaningful that we believe in a God who came and suffered with us on the cross, that he comes right into the middle of our pain. And I'd like us to take a look at the story of the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14, verses 32 to 36. And we find Jesus here in great turmoil as he prepares for the cross. So it says, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if it was possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. There's so much in that passage that I think can really help us when we're struggling with unanswered prayer. The first thing to notice is how vulnerable Jesus is with his friends. We are told he is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, and yet he very intentionally takes his 3 best friends into his place of grief, and he asks them for their support. I think when we suffer, there's this massive temptation to hide and isolate ourselves, but Jesus does the opposite. He includes his friends, and he knows he needs their help. The next thing to note is that in Jesus' hour of greatest need, he pursues prayer. He knows his friends are important, but that his Father's presence was what he needed. When God speaks, it can bring us so much comfort, right? And then notice what Jesus prays. It's so vulnerable. First of all, Jesus says, Abba, Father. As he's hurting, he anchors himself in the love of God. He knows he is still a dearly loved child of God. Then he continues, everything is possible for you. So having affirmed God's love, he affirms God's power. I know in my life when I'm scared and suffering or hurting, there's a temptation to question God's love or power. But Jesus doesn't do either of those things. He affirms God's love and God's power. The next phrase is really surprising. Jesus says, "Take this cup from me." In other words, Jesus is saying, I don't want to die. I don't want to suffer. It's radically honest and vulnerable. And it's essential that we are honest when we are hurting and scared and suffering. So let's be honest with our friends and honest with God. Lastly, Jesus utters that great prayer of relinquishment. Not my will, but your will be done. And that is the hardest prayer anyone can ever pray when we're in these situations and scared and hurting, because God doesn't seem to be answering our prayers the way we want. The prayer of relinquishment is hard because every fibre in your being wants God to come and rescue you, but you choose to trust him anyway. I think a question we all wrestle with at some point is, if God is our Abba Father, if he is all loving and all powerful, why doesn't he stop some people from suffering? Why doesn't he answer our prayers, especially when we're asking for good things? And this is such a hard question, and there aren't really any easy answers, but I found it helpful to think in terms of three things. So, number one, God's world. 2, God's war, and 3, God's will. So firstly, God's world. Some prayers aren't answered because it's just the way God has made the world to work. For example, and Christians just aren't immune from the laws of nature and science, right? So for example, rain on wedding days. I'm sure if every single couple got sun on their wedding day, there'd be drought, right? And I think that for every couple praying for sun, there's probably also a farmer somewhere praying for rain. And there are laws that just make the world work for the vast majority of people most of the time, and we are not exempt from that system. Secondly, God's war. The Bible teaches that we're in a spiritual battle, and sometimes prayers are not answered because there is an enemy actively and successfully opposing the will of God. And we're going to look at this in a bit more detail next week. And then thirdly, God's will. Sometimes it's not the rules of nature or Satan opposing our prayers, but God says no, or not yet. And in some cases, this is relatively straightforward because we can accept God knows best. And when we look back, we're actually quite glad God didn't answer our prayer. Like, I'm really glad some of my prayers haven't been answered, else I'd be surrounded by talking teddy bears and living on a spaceship. So I think it's actually pretty good that God didn't answer those childhood prayers. But obviously there are other prayers that God says no to, and we don't understand why, and we can feel hurt and angry because they're really important to us, right? And they really matter, and they're about big and important things. But when I'm in that place of hurt and anger, I just have to choose to trust in God even when I don't understand. And lastly, I just think it's really important to remember God's silence isn't the same as his absence. Just because your prayers aren't working or God seems distant, it doesn't mean that he's far away, because he's promised in the Bible that he will never leave you. And in times like this, I think it's best to ask God, not why, but where are you? Because he's always at work. And often when we're new Christians, it's like we can see and feel God so easily, and then we'll go through seasons in our life where we can't see or feel God the way we want to. And it's not that he's abandoned us. Instead, he's trying to mature us into something new. He's present, but he's also allowing us to grow into a new maturity. And I often think of this a bit like when you're teaching a toddler to walk and you just stand like a couple of steps ahead of them with your arms like wide open to that, like, come to me. So I hope all these things have been helpful and encouraged you to be really real with your trusted friends about the areas of your life that you're experiencing disappointment, but also to keep coming back to God and expressing your anger and frustration and hurt just time and time again. And if you're struggling with unanswered prayer, I really recommend opening up the Psalms and just using them to help you form the language you need to really lament the pain and the frustration that you feel. There's an amazing article by N.T. Wright in Time at the moment, and it ends by saying, it is not part of the Christian vocation then to be able to explain what's happening and why. In fact, it is part of the Christian vocation not to be able to explain. and to lament instead. And the Spirit laments within us, so we become, even in our self-isolation, small shrines where the presence and healing of God can dwell. And out of that, there can emerge new possibilities, new acts of kindness, new scientific understanding, and new hope. God can take all of our big and complex emotions, so just be real with Him. Okay, so let's move on to prayer styles. There are so many of these, it's quite hard to pick which ones to do. So we're going to do 3 right now, and then we're going to do some more next week as well. So as individuals created in God's image to reflect His glory in a unique way, it's no surprise that we all connect with God in prayer differently. However, one of the inescapable things for all of us, and I know we don't like talking about it very much, is that prayer is a habit, and we all know that habits require commitment. The good news, however, is that God promises to help teach us how to pray if we ask Him. So I wonder, what would it look like if everyone made prayer a top priority in their life for the next 10 days? So here's my challenge to you. When this meeting ends, get out your diary, or do it now if you want, and schedule some time in with God. Treat it like you would a very important meeting. And then once you've done this, set yourself some alarms or reminders on your phone. I think it's so easy for life to get in the way. So if you miss a day, don't beat yourself up, be kind to yourself, but do make the commitment to try again tomorrow. And for those who already pray regularly, why don't you ask God the question, what would it look like to stretch myself in prayer? Okay, so once you've made God a priority in your diary, think about where you're going to go and pray. So where is most comfortable and appealing for you? Matthew 6 says, whenever you pray, go into your innermost chamber and be alone with Father God. Where is that private place that you go to be alone with God? Is it a particular chair or room, or for those of us that are lucky enough, a garden? For me, it's my bed, and I won't get up until I've spent some time with God. But it isn't always somewhere you've got to be still. Maybe it's where you're cleaning or when you're exercising, and sometimes it's actually easier to pray when you're on the go. Before the virus happened and I was confined to my house, I used to love to swim and pray. And over the next few days, why don't you experiment and find out what works best for you? And when you're getting started, reward yourself for carrying out the habit. Maybe the reward is simply that you feel more refreshed after spending time with God. Or maybe, you're like me, and you like cake, so you make yourself a little sweet treat. Or maybe you buy yourself a little gift. Make your prayer time as enjoyable as possible. Okay, so now let's think about what that prayer time will look like. So we've talked about following the PRAY steps. So beginning by pausing in God's presence, then being still, and then rejoicing with worship, adoring God, taking time to be thankful. Then we ask for our needs and the needs of others, and end by giving it all back to God and yielding to His will in our lives. There are so many tools you can use within the PRAY model. And we each have our own unique gifts and preferences. So it's only natural that different things are going to appeal to us. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to give us a whistle-stop tour of some of the different ways we can pray. And if you've got any questions or you want any notes on any of them, please do give me an email. It's charlotte@stmarieslondon.com. So I'm going to start with one of my favourite ways to pray, getting creative. So we're each made in the image of a God who is infinitely creative, and that means that each of us have the ability to create too. Getting creative with God is all about the process. So I'd encourage you as much as you can, just let go of the worrying about the end result. Like, I'm really bad for this, but just try and let it go. Sometimes we can get really caught up in this desire to achieve in prayer and feel like we've done the work. But creating gives us the space and permission to just be quiet and reflect. So do what you love, get out your pencils, your pens, your paints, your instruments, your knitting needles, and invite God in. There are so many ways to do this. Maybe paint or draw a Bible verse and ask God to speak to you about it. Note what stands out to you and ask God questions and just wait for him to answer as you do it. Or maybe ask God to show you a picture and create that. God can often speak to us so powerfully through pictures. So you might remember the story that Maddie shared at church recently, where she created this picture and written the words, "She's safe," only to come back to it like a long time in the future. And those are the exact words she needed to hear because of her circumstances. And I just think this is such a good way to start a prayer session because it fits quite nicely in taking time to like pause. But maybe paint isn't your thing and you might want to write a song or just sing out to God or even dance. Prayer and worship are so closely linked, and many songs contain prayer. For example, Our Father, the lyrics are literally the Lord's Prayer. And it can be amazing the way God meets our needs as we choose to worship. There's this amazing example of this in Acts 16, verses 25 to 31. So Paul and Silas have been traveling around when a girl with a spirit starts following them and fortune telling. And Paul basically gets so fed up with this that in the end he casts out the spirit. And the girl's owners, realizing their source of income has gone, get so annoyed that they drag Paul and Silas to be judged by the authorities, who sentence them to be severely beaten and cast into prison. So from verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and at once the prison doors flew open and everyone's chains came loose. God knows what we need before we ask, and he can do the most incredible things in response to our worship. Okay, next, the EXAMEN. This is a simple 4-step tool to reflect and pray about our day. And it kind of goes through all the PRA steps at once. And this is great because it's an instant solution to the question, what will I pray about? Because it's literally your day. Daily life is so rich and meaningful, even when we kind of miss it in the hubbub of it all. Every encounter, every challenge, every disappointment and every delight is a place where we can find God. So the EXAMEN was popularized by Ignatius in the 16th century, and it's helped millions of Christians to focus on Jesus as they come to the end of their day. So this practical way of reviewing the day before you go to sleep gives you an opportunity to become aware of the ways God's presence has been pursuing you. It also encourages us to pay attention to the promptings of God that we might have missed and become aware of the places where we need to ask God for help. So let me walk you through how it works, and then hopefully we're going to have some group discussions at the end of this and there'll be a chance to give it a go. So first, replay. Think of your day like a movie replaying in your head. Pay particular attention to the way you feel and the things that you notice as you go through your day. Then rejoice. Thank God for the things that are obvious, but also pay attention to the things that aren't obvious as well, and thank him for those, the things that we might sometimes forget. Then repent. So say sorry to God for the moments that come into your mind as you review the day and receive his forgiveness. But don't go digging around here. Just give them to God and then leave them with him. Know that they're dealt with. And then finally, reboot. So this bit is all about looking forward to tomorrow. So ask to be filled with the Holy Spirit and for strength. The EXAMEN can take 5 minutes or it can take an hour. And even doing it once will be useful. But I think if you do it daily, it can bring transformation. And I highly recommend Every Night with Matt, which is on the St. Mary's app, which I've listened to so many times, I can basically now quote it word for word. But I just find when I do it, I go to sleep and I feel so much more peaceful and so much more aware of God's presence. And then the final thing I'm going to recommend to us as I come into land is the Inner Room app from 24/7 Prayer, which is fantastic. And with so much to pray for right now, I'm finding it the most invaluable tool. I think I could so easily be overwhelmed by all the things I'm praying for, but this app helps me organise them all and pray for them in smaller chunks. So here's a little screen share I made to introduce the app. So this is the Inner Room app. This is the homepage. As you see, there's a Pray Now button where you can pray through your prayer list. There's a quick pray, which I really like, and it helps you pray through 3 things really quickly, which I'll show you in a second. There's also Pray For, which is led prayers at 24/7 I've put up there, and a quick ad for when something just pops into your mind and you really want to quickly add it. Then at the bottom, you've got your prayer stats, which I find really encouraging. Because if you just pray a little bit per day, it really adds up. And then you've got your home screen at the bottom. Then the next one along is your prayer playlists, which I'll show you, but this is how you add prayers in and how you kind of sort them into different topics. Then you've got a Pray Now button in the middle, and then the next one is an inspiration, and then there's a little bit more now there. So if I show you the quick pray button, it'll give you a little countdown, and then it basically pops up 3 things, and you can kind of go through them. So those are mostly things from the prayer page on Facebook, and actually it's amazing because George, who was the last one, is now out of hospital, so I should move that into the thanks pile later, which you can do. You can kind of say thank you for the things that have answered, and they move into a new list, so you can keep track of where God's been answering prayer, which again is super encouraging. And then you can also archive things, because sometimes you pray for things for a while and it's good to just leave them. So then you've got the Pray Now, so you can choose which prayer list you'd like. So I've obviously created my own for the different things that I'm praying for at the moment. So I might like to start praying for coronavirus crisis, where I've just made a few like random prayer prompts to help me. And then you can choose how long you want to pray for. So maybe, I've got the kettle on, I've got a couple of minutes, so I want to make it a little bit shorter. The minimum I can pray for this is 8 minutes apparently, because I've put so many things in there, so it sort of adapts a little bit. But you can pray anytime up to an hour. And then you can choose whether the audio is on or off. If you've got the audio on, it's got background music, and then as each thing comes up, it tells you now move on to praying for this thing that you've put in your prayer list, which is really nice. And then Pray For is really good. It's got suggestions of how to pray for things, which 24/7 have made. And then at the bottom, the second button along, is how you add new prayers. So you click Add New Prayer. You can make your own categories up. So by clicking Add a Topic at the bottom, and then you just pick whichever topic you want. So you put an area of your life. I'm going to put in tech support, because I feel like there is so much that I'm having to learn at the moment. And then you can add a photo if you want. This is really nice when you're praying for people, because their faces just pop up on the prayer playlist, which I find is really nice. And then that's there, and it's added to your prayer board to keep helping remind you how to pray. So that is everything. Let me know if you've got any further questions, but hopefully that helps a little bit. So Arabella in the chat has also handily mentioned the YouVersion Bible app, which has got a prayer list feature, which is also really good. I use that for devotionals pretty much every day, so it's really nice to be able to keep everything linked. And there's another one called PrayerMate as well. But I can honestly say that this is the best tool I've come across for making prayer really accessible, and particularly the quick pray button. So this and then if anyone needs any help downloading it or anything, do send me an email and let me know. And a link to all of these can be found on the resources page of our website, including YouVersion. So it's www.maryslondon.com/resources. So today we've covered creating, the EXAMEN, and the Inner Room app. So I'd encourage you to pick one, try it out this week, and see how you meet with God. And then next week, we're going to be looking at Lectio Divina, prayer walking, journaling, and spiritual warfare. And I'm also going to be making some recommendations for how to pray based on your Myers-Briggs personality type, which I know will make some people very happy and probably frustrate some people, because I know personality types are a little bit of a love-hate thing. But there's a great website called 16 Personalities for finding out your type, so feel free to check that out before the session.